Okay. So just a couple of housekeeping comments. Next week will be in person and we'll be in 12 IJK. So just be aware of that slightly unusual circumstance. And then I'm going to hand it off to Alan, who's going to start with the introductions.
Thank you, James. I'm here as the principal investigator of the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employment for People with Physical Disabilities. We are in our final year of this activity, and I'm delighted that we are able to host what we call our Neidler Invited Lectureship, which today is Mark Harness. Linda Ehrlich-Jones will be introducing him. Linda is, I think, familiar, known to just about everybody on the call. She's the Associate Director of the Center for Rehabilitation Outcomes Research at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. And in the context of this, our RTC has served as our knowledge translation director. In Northwestern University, she's a research professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation, and her research focuses on promotion of healthy lifestyle, physical activity, and nutrition in persons with chronic conditions using motivational interviewing. So with no further ado, Linda, I'll let you introduce Mark.
Great, thank you, Alan. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Mark Harness. Dr. Harness is an associate professor in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Washington. He is the director of the UW University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, the director of the UW Center for Technology and Disability, and education director of the Center for Research and Education on Accessible Technology and Experiences. His research focuses on knowledge translation, assistive technology, and accessible design for people with disabilities. And he is core faculty in the Disability Studies program and the PhD program in Rehabilitation Sciences program. And he's here today to talk about his project on this Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on a decision aid for requesting job accommodations. So welcome, Mark.
Great, thank you, Linda. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I hope that you are seeing a beginning of a PowerPoint.
Yep.
Well, so good morning from Seattle, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Linda. I'll just add a few more things. First, I use he, him pronouns, and for those who can't see me, I'll give you a visual description. I'm a tall white man in my 50s with brown hair and blue eyes. I'm wearing a navy blue button-up shirt and transparent reading glasses. Relevant to today's discussion, I do not identify as disabled, but I do position myself as an ally. I will be representing the perspectives of people with disabilities who have shared their experiences with our research team today, and I will try to do that with fidelity. I'm also going to try to present accessibly today, so I will be describing any images that you see on the screen. And then finally, I just wanted to make a comment about language. I will use both person-first language, so a person with a disability, and I will also use identity-first language, so disabled person. And in my world of rehabilitation medicine, of course, we've been taught to use person-first language to place the emphasis on the person, not on the disability or impairment. But increasingly in the field of disability studies and in certain disability communities, there's been a move toward identity-first language as a way of showcasing that the disability is part of the person's identity and is something that they have pride in. And so I'm going to use both forms interchangeably in acknowledgement of those different norms. And last but not least, I'll just add that I will be discussing legal concepts, but I am not a lawyer, so please don't consider anything I say to be legal advice. I do not have any disclosures related to conflict of interest for this presentation. And I want to acknowledge, as Alan mentioned, that this work was developed under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, known as NIDLR. That is a center within the Administration for Community Living, ACL. And so Alan had a grant, was the PI of the grant at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, and we had a subaward at the University of Washington. And this slide contains the logos of ACL and NIDLR. So today I want to discuss 5 agenda items. It's a little bit strange, I know, but I'm going to start by telling you what we did. I think you're going to need this context to help you follow the rest of the presentation. And then I'm going to go back and talk about reasonable accommodations more generally. and the challenges that people face in requesting them. I'm going to talk about the factors that affect the outcomes of reasonable accommodation requests. This is based on a scoping review we conducted. I'm going to talk about what people with disabilities have said about the reasonable accommodation process from some of our focus group and interview work. And then I'm going to return to the decision aid, talk about the structure of the aid, and give you a brief demo. So what did we do? Well, I'm going to make the case later in this presentation that the reasonable accommodation process is complex. And given the complexity of the decisions that are associated with the request for reasonable accommodations, we wondered how we could provide support to people with disabilities who are navigating this process. And in the health and medical field, there's been a history of developing patient decision aids that guide individuals through difficult health-related questions like, should I have this surgery? Should I take this medication? Should I engage in this radiation therapy? And so on. And so decision aids are tools that guide individuals through a set of options. They provide information about pros and cons of each option. They elicit preferences. They support deliberation. They facilitate a decision. And they guide individuals through complicated choices, and they're intended to help them make value-based trade-offs between the benefits and harms of a decision, and specifically to make those value-based trade-offs within the context of their own specific situation. There's good evidence that people who use decision aids improve their knowledge of options. They're better informed. They have more clarity about their values, their own values, about what they most think is important. They have expectations about benefits and harms of treatments that are more accurate. In other words, they understand the benefits and harms better, and they are more likely to participate in decision making. So given these benefits of patient decision aids, we decided to try to apply this decision aid framework to support decision-making related to a rights-based decision rather than a health-related decision. And that decision is whether and how to request a reasonable accommodation in employment. So to develop the decision aid, which I will show you later, we've been working through a process that includes a scoping review to really understand the research about reasonable accommodations, focus groups and interviews with employers, people with disabilities, and vocational rehabilitation counselors to understand challenges in making a request. We have engaged in iterative design of the decision aid using a design team. We've tested it with users and experts, and we're currently in the process of conducting some small N proof of concept research studies. So I'm going to come back to the decision aid, but now I want to kind of back up a little bit and discuss the reasonable accommodation process in more detail. So I understand that some of you know a lot about reasonable accommodations, and some of you are new to the topic. And so I want to start by defining reasonable accommodations, giving you a few examples, and clarifying the context within which we began our project. And hopefully, even if you're familiar with the concept, this activity will help you understand why a decision aid might be a useful tool. So to start with the definition, a reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job, the work environment, or the way things are usually done during the hiring process. And so these adjustments are made for several reasons: to ensure equal opportunity in the application process, to enable a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of a job. And those italicized words are words that we're going to come back to because they need to be defined. And to make it possible for an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. Reasonable accommodations are a civil right. That means that they are afforded by the laws of the United States government, and in this case, under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. It also means that they're available to every person in this country who meets the criteria, and in this case, that means that they are a qualified individual with a disability, which is another term that I'll just define in just a moment. Reasonable accommodations are intended to provide equal access, and so that means they are a form of equity. And when we discuss equity, we often use analogies like, these are rights that open the door so you can walk in, but they don't necessarily do the walking, or if you use a wheelchair, the rolling for you. Or we might say that they level the playing field, which means they create a situation where everyone has an equal chance of participating and succeeding. And in the image on this slide, we see three people of different heights reaching to pick an apple from a tree. The left image shows them standing on the same size boxes, and only the tall person can reach the apple. The right image shows them on different size boxes that are appropriate to their height, and now they can all reach to the same height on the tree. And it's important, I think, to highlight this concept because sometimes people out in the world believe that reasonable accommodations are a form of special treatment or a special benefit for people with disabilities. And this is really not the case. They are an attempt to provide equity to people with disabilities. So there is no specific list of approved accommodations, but here are some examples of common ones. They can be physical changes like installing a ramp or modifying a restroom. They can be the provision of accessible and assistive technologies like providing screen reader software. They can be provision of accessible communication like providing sign language or making materials available in Braille. And they can also be policy enhancements like modifying a policy to allow a service animal in a business setting. Now I'm going to walk through a few key terms that I mentioned before just to give you some background, but also to begin to illustrate the complexity of the reasonable accommodation process. I mentioned to you that you have to be a qualified person with a disability in order to request reasonable accommodation. So before we can get to that definition, we have to first understand the definition of disability under the ADA. So the ADA defines a person with a disability as someone who meets one of three criteria. They have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And this is probably what most of us think about when we think about disability under the ADA. But the ADA also acknowledges sort of the social systems in which people with disabilities find themselves and acknowledges that discrimination exists. And so these last two criteria are really framed within that context. So you are also a person with a disability under the ADA if you have a history or a record of an impairment, such as cancer that's in remission. And that history sometimes can be used to support discriminatory action. And finally, you're considered a person with a disability if you're regarded as having such an impairment by others, even if you don't actually have a disability. So, for example, a person who has scars from a severe burn that doesn't limit their major life activity could still be considered a person with a disability under the ADA and experience discrimination. So that's the definition of disability. What does it mean to be a qualified individual with disability? Well, under Title I of the ADA, employers only have to provide reasonable accommodations if you're a person with disability who satisfies the requisite skill, experience, education, and other job-related requirements of the employment position, and with or without reasonable accommodation can perform the essential functions of the job. And again, those bulleted terms are important. Job prerequisites include educational level, years of work experience, specific training, skills, licenses, etc. This is often information in the hiring statement or the position description. And essential functions are the fundamental duties of the job. So duties may be essential when the job was created to perform that function. There's only a few people who can do that job function, or if the function is highly specialized and the employee was specifically hired to perform that function. So I'm going to talk more about challenges that people face when they are considering making a request for accommodation. But just based on what I just discussed, those definitions, I want to note a first challenge, which is simply determining whether you are a qualified person with a disability under the ADA. To do this, a person has to understand the key terminology. They have to acknowledge and disclose that they have a disability as defined by the law, and they have to apply the concepts to their own unique situation. So it may be obvious to you that one big part of making this determination is about knowledge. So there's an educational component, but there are other pieces related to this as well. So for example, a person's own sense of identity and the extent to which they identify as a person with a disability who has rights under the ADA. So we'll talk more about some of these issues next. So a metaphor that we find useful is to think about reasonable accommodations as an iceberg. So even on the surface, icebergs are pretty formidable. And that's true of the reasonable accommodation process too. So people with disabilities have to understand the law, how it protects their rights. They need to understand how it applies to them, whether they're qualified, what their essential duties of their job are. I would stop and just ask everybody if you know what the essential duties of your job are right now, without sort of sitting down and thinking that through. They need to understand both the general process of requesting, but also how that works within their specific company. And finally, they need to understand the concept of accommodations, the kinds of accommodations that are available, and to think about what accommodations would work best for them. And that alone is fairly daunting. And on this slide, there is an image of an iceberg, and we can see kind of reflected below in the water, the section below. So that's challenging enough, the top of the iceberg, but just like real icebergs, the biggest part lies beneath the surface. So people also bring personal beliefs and values with them about disability and disability identity. They might have complicated feelings about whether asking for a reasonable accommodation is a form of help seeking versus a form of rights activation. People may make requests for accommodations in workplaces that are very different, some of which are supportive and some of which are potentially hostile, and they may have legitimate concerns about fairness and anticipated compliance. They may worry about interpersonal relationships and how disclosure of disability and access to an accommodation may affect relationships with a boss or with a coworker, especially if it affects their reputation or it stigmatizes them. And they may have legitimate fears about discrimination and retaliation. And all of this is complicated by the type of disability they have. We know that some disabilities are more stigmatized and more challenging to accommodate. So given all of that, I want to talk about some factors that affect the outcomes of reasonable accommodation requests. And I mentioned that we conducted a scoping review to understand the research addressing reasonable accommodations. And so we took what we learned from that scoping review, we combined it with some other data sources, and we developed a conceptual or logic model. And we used, so not just research, but other data sources like information that we gleaned from my work with the ADA National Network. If you're familiar with that, that's a network of 10 regional ADA centers that provide technical assistance and training. And we also went to more informal sources like blogs and news features written by people with disabilities discussing challenges of seeking reasonable accommodation to kind of flesh out some of the concerns and some of the factors that are related to a successful or unsuccessful request for accommodation. So we identified 5 factors that affect outcomes of reasonable accommodation requests. They include characteristics of the workplace culture, characteristics of the accommodation requested, characteristics of the requester, characteristics of the support system, and timing of the request. And I'll talk through each of those. So workplace culture matters when it comes to a request for reasonable accommodation. We know that people are more likely to request an accommodation when they have a higher expectancy of success that they will receive the accommodation. And so the kinds of things that they look for are, are there other people with disabilities who are visible in this company? Are there other people who I know that have accommodations? What do I know about the employer's attitudes? Has my boss made positive statements about accommodations or about people with disabilities? Is there an affinity group for people with disabilities? Do I see a reasonable accommodation process that's clearly outlined? Those are all examples of things that help people assess the accommodation culture of a workplace. We also know that type of organization seems to matter. Employees in nonprofit or governmental organizations are more likely to request accommodations than those in private. Employees in large businesses are more likely to request than those in smaller businesses. And this is likely tied into accommodation culture of those different workplaces. And then employers' understanding of accommodation matters as well. So are employers afraid of the cost of accommodations? Do they understand the benefits in retaining valued employees? Do they feel confident that they know how to implement it in a way that makes sure that they meet the requirements of the law? These are all things that matter within the context of the workplace culture. The type of accommodation that's requested can affect outcomes as well. One of the things that people talk about is the magnitude of the accommodation, and that generally fits into two items. The cost of the accommodation can affect the willingness of an employer to provide it, and the amount of change required to standard processes can also affect as well. So kind of how big of a change, how much of it is going to cost may affect the success of a request. The other thing that's true about the characteristics of the accommodation are the acceptability of it. So accommodations that are widely accepted or understood are more likely to be granted, but those that are not well understood or not well publicized, or people aren't aware of them, are less likely. And one thing that we do know is that non-apparent disabilities, sometimes called invisible disabilities, can be more difficult for employers to understand. So mental health and social behavioral accommodations are harder. The third factor has to do with characteristics of the requester. And I just realized I didn't describe the images on those previous slides. They were primarily I just lost the word. They weren't meant to describe anything. They were pictures of offices. And on this slide, there's a picture of a woman in a wheelchair wearing a bright red shirt and smiling as she walks down, as she pushes through the sidewalk. So characteristics of the requester. There are a number of research studies that talk about this, largely because I think people used existing data sets like the EEOC complaints to try to understand the demographics of requests. Some of these things are not alterable, and some of them are alterable. And in our decision aid, we didn't put a lot of focus on things that people can't change. But it's useful to know that older people are less likely to make a request. We think this is likely because they may not identify as a person with a disability. They may just say, I'm getting old. There is some suggestion that race or ethnicity matters, that white and Hispanic people are more likely to report using accommodations than African Americans. Income seems to have some effect. People in low-income jobs are less likely to request accommodations or to have accommodating employers. The nature of the disability seems to matter. As I mentioned before, apparent versus non-apparent disabilities. People understand disability that they can see more than they understand disability they cannot see. So people with psychiatric disabilities and people with multiple disabilities are less likely to request. And also, under nature of disability, people with more progressive forms of conditions are more likely to use workplace accommodations than others. And people with more serious mental health symptoms are more likely to request. And this likely ties into kind of a risk-benefit analysis. A lot of people wait to make a request until they absolutely need it because of all the factors that I discussed before. And then fourth, the characteristics of the support system. This slide has an image of somebody sitting on a chair facing somebody whose back is to us, who's using a clipboard. And having a support system in place can make a difference in whether somebody's willing to make a request for accommodation. So if you're connected with vocational rehabilitation, you might have a counselor who will help you and support you. If you work with an affinity group as part of your company, there might be people there who can guide you through the process. Connection to disability community can help, as people who have had previous experience with accommodation can provide guidance as well. And the last thing that seems to matter is timing of the request. So some people may know before they apply for a position that they're going to need an accommodation, but not everybody does. They may realize they need one while they're in the application process. In general, people try to wait to disclose disability until they're offered a position. And this is a practice that's not only legal, but it's encouraged, because the employer shouldn't be factoring disability into the hiring process. And disclosing too early may result in discrimination that would be hard to prove after the fact. And so these decisions about timing can be challenging, and people may not make great decisions about when and how to do that. People may also want to make the request during the process of being hired, or they may choose to wait until the hiring process is completed and they've been in the job for a certain period of time. Some people do that because they want to sort of prove their worth before they make a request. Again, all of the social kind of piece that comes into play. And finally, just an acknowledgement that transition points can be difficult. So accommodations that were allowed in college may not be allowed at work. Moving from job to job can require renegotiating previously established communications. And all of those challenges play out in the outcome of the request. So now I want to talk a little bit about what people with disabilities said in our focus groups about reasonable accommodation, and I think this provides a little bit more nuance. We conducted interviews and focus groups with individuals with disabilities, VR counselors, both in state VR and the American Indian VR system, and with some mid to large size employers. And and 5 key themes came out of those discussions. One was risk analysis. The second was negotiating strategies. Third was settling for partial accommodations. The fourth was retaliation or feeling punished for a reasonable accommodation request. And the fifth is the importance of role models. So all of the participants with disabilities talked about the types of signals they looked for to get a sense of how inclusive the work environment is. Oh, and by the way, this slide is blank on purpose, so I'll put up some things in just a minute. So they looked for things like explicit policy statements, instructions for requesting accommodations, or whether there were other employees openly using accommodations. And when they discussed risk, most respondents were more concerned about their reputation being tarnished. For example, something placed on my employment record was a common refrain. They worried about being resented by fellow workers or judged as less effective at their job by the mere request for an accommodation. And one participant noted that the conversation happened only because the precondition was already met, that I felt fairly confident that the information was not going to be used in any retaliatory or inappropriate fashion. That was Beatrice, somebody with cerebral palsy. And organizational work culture was a key factor in weighing the risks and benefits of requesting an accommodation, but leadership and attitudes of direct supervisors played an even more prominent role in our respondents' assessment of the work culture around accommodation and the potential risks of even disclosing having a disability. And Mary, who was a savvy HR manager, was pretty well aware of this. She told us, we heavily advertise that if you need some help doing your job, to please reach out to us. We have a post-offer health assessment form that candidates fill out. And on there's a specific question about requesting an accommodation. Part of my role for onboarding assessment is to review that, and if they answer yes to accommodation request, then that opens up further dialogue as to what their needs are and how it fits in the essential functions of the job. And so Mary is an example of an employer that's really taken a positive, proactive effort to ensure that people understand that they can and should request accommodation if they need it because of their disability. And you can imagine the flip side of that in an organization where it's difficult to find information about how to request an accommodation. And so it feels more risky because there's not this messaging that happens about the company's positive approach to accommodation. Another theme is about negotiation strategies, and we just found that negotiation strategies seem to vary for participants kind of along the lines of the length of time in the workforce. So it's kind of generational. People who were working before the ADA may be less inclined to engage in the negotiation with employers that would result in them receiving the accommodations that they need. We also found that people who were more connected with disability communities, who had more exposure to disability rights or disability pride, were more likely to proactively negotiate and engage with their employer. And finally, we found that people who had access to role models, other people with disabilities who were thriving in the workplace, then they were also more likely to engage in negotiation strategies with their employer. And these three factors really shape how individuals approach negotiating when requesting accommodations. Theme number 3 is settling for partial accommodations. And this, I think, is really important to think about. We found that it was very common among our disabled participants to accept or settle for partial accommodations. So respondents who had both apparent disabilities and non-apparent disabilities, so they had multiple disabilities, often would request accommodations for the apparent disability, but not for the non-apparent disability. So they might, maybe they used a wheelchair, so they needed a desk that was higher. They would request that, but they also had ADHD and they needed to use noise canceling headphones or needed to have a quiet space. They would not request that. So these were decisions that were obviously tied into sort of the stigma that's associated with non-apparent or invisible disabilities. We also saw that people with fluctuating or degenerative conditions would expressed reluctance to update or change or expand their accommodation requests as their needs changed. And so, you know, they would negotiate an accommodation and they would just stick with that accommodation even if their needs changed and they needed something different. And nearly all of our respondents indicated that their first preference was to accommodate themselves when or where possible before asking for anything from their employers. So these findings, I think, suggest that many people with disabilities, even those who are actively using accommodations, are not being fully or not adequately accommodated at their jobs. Theme 4 has to do with retaliation, and you know, we talked about the risk analysis that people do around an accommodation request. This is a quote from Jasmine, one of our participants in the study with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and she said, "I thankfully haven't had employers be mad about it, but I definitely have had peers, definitely. Especially when I had just gotten off workers' comp and just moved back in. I had a 10-pound weight limit, and so I was doing absolutely nothing hands-on, and there was a lot of hostility. And so managing expectations of supervisors and coworkers is an ongoing process for people with disabilities who are requesting accommodations. And so thinking about just strategies for managing identity and disclosure to coworkers is really important after an accommodation request. And we even heard from some employers that they have introduced accommodations for a disabled employee that kind of minimize the need for that worker to have to explain or justify the accommodation with others. So employers and employees are trying to think through what will it mean for me in this workplace climate if I have something different, or I and my coworkers see that. One of our employers in the focus group talked about adjustable standing desks and how once they gave one to a person with a disability, everybody wanted one. And so this kind of social dynamic definitely plays out. And the last theme is role models. And so I think it's really important to think about the extent to which people can look around them and see somebody like them who can help them to navigate their way through a system. And Amy told us, so like when my friends at this company travel, they can take a visual interpreter with them. And when my blind friends at another company make a PowerPoint, they can set up a meeting with a visual interpreter to help them like format their slides. And that is what needs to happen more widespread. I've seen my blind friends like in action with their visual interpreters, and I think that's been a really good model. So without exception, disabled respondents discuss the importance of, and most frequently the stark lack of role models for disabled people thriving successfully in their jobs. People who don't minimize their disability, who don't minimize their accommodations. And role models play an important role for affirming disability identity, but they also, they help people to see concrete examples of how accommodations can work. And a connection to a strong support network of positive disability communities is an important factor for all of our respondents. So to sum up, our findings really highlight some gaps in existing literature on workplace accommodations. Those include the importance of employers signaling genuinely inclusive workspaces, the lack of strategies that we see for managing expectations of supervisors and coworkers around disability after an accommodation has been implemented, and this need for role models in workplaces. So with that, I will finally tell you a little bit more about our decision aid. We decided that at a very high level, there are 3 decision stages in the reasonable accommodation process. Before the request, an individual needs to understand the process, decide whether to make a request, and if they are moving forward, how to make the best request. During the process, they need to decide how to respond to requests for information. And after the request, they need to decide how to implement the accommodation if the request was successful, and what to do if the request was not successful. And so these phases are the overarching structure of our decision aid tool. And within those stages, we implemented 3 components that are common to patient decision aids. These are learn, reflect, and apply components. So for each stage, there's a section where the individual can learn more about the process. So basically an education component. There's a component that supports reflection. So that's an application of knowledge to an individual's specific situation that includes self-assessments about beliefs, identity, concerns. And finally, there's an application section where an individual merges what they know about the process with what they know about themselves and their workplace culture to decide whether and how to make a request. And I know this may be hard to see, but this is an example of the before section of the decision aid divided out across the learn, reflect, apply components. And so you can see that the first one is, what is a disability? What are common assumptions? If you go over to reflect, then the reflection would be, what are your assumptions and beliefs about disability? And under apply, how does this affect your willingness to explore reasonable accommodation? And so for a variety of questions, we have these learn, reflect, apply sections. And so I'm going to give you a quick demo. Yeah, I have time. So I will stop share. And I will share the tool. Let's see. There we go. And you should be seeing a web page that has the words requesting reasonable accommodations employment at the top. So this is what the tool looks like when you come to it. There's a little bit of information here about how to get started and what is a reasonable accommodation. This tool is database driven, so there are places where you can type in information. In other words, we collect some user data. And so it's important for people to set up an account and be able to sign in and out. That also allows them to start to work on the tool and then stop and come back to it, because it's not something you can do in an hour. There is a place to look at some settings. There are reports. I'll come back to those in just a minute. There's a nice help section that helps people understand what the tool's about. If you click on this little, we call this a hamburger, you get the pop-out navigation. And what you see over here in the navigation is that we have the before, during, and after the request fields. And for each of these questions, we have a drop-down that gives you the learn, reflect, and apply that's associated with it. And so before the request, the first module is, what is a disability? Second is, how is disability defined under the ADA? The third is, am I a qualified individual with a disability? What are reasonable accommodations under the ADA? What are the risks of disability disclosure? Understanding personal risk tolerance, and then making a decision. And under making the request, we just have one module. How can I make the strongest request for accommodations? And then under the after the request, we have what challenges can occur. What else should I do if my request is approved? What if I'm offered a different reasonable accommodation than I requested? What if my request is denied, and what happens later if I need a different or additional reasonable accommodation? And so people can use this left nav, or they can just come down and they can click next to go through the sections. There are a number of sections that have drop downs for more information. And we tried to put examples from lessons from lived experience throughout the tool as a way of highlighting the experience of people with disabilities. So I won't spend a lot of time showing you this, but I will go to just, am I a qualified individual with disability? And if I click on Learn, you'll see that there's a nice section about what a qualified individual with disability is under the ADA, and then what prerequisites are, what essential functions are. And then if we go to the Reflect section, there is a place for us to start filling in some information. And I filled in some very simple information, but there's a place to write a statement describing the prerequisites for your job. And then there's a place to add your essential duties or essential functions. So I added that I present at conferences. And when I put that in, I get some questions that ask me whether the position exists to perform this task, and etc. And these are the questions that you saw that are really about defining whether this is an essential duty or not. And we also capture the percentage of time that somebody thinks they engage in that task. And you can see that the tool says this task is likely an essential duty. So we're trying to begin to get people to put in their duties, to capture those, and to figure out whether those are essential or not. This one down here, I said I participate in meetings, but this is not an essential. I said my position doesn't exist to perform this task. And the tool said, well, this task isn't an essential duty. And then if I click on the next link to go to the Apply section, under this section, I see everything that I filled in on the previous page. And I can identify whether this is something I can perform without accommodations, perform with accommodations, or if I can perform this task with or without. I could not perform this task with or without accommodations. And so because I said I can perform it with accommodations, this is going to ensure that I am identified as a qualified individual with disability. And so this is kind of how the tool works. And then this all gets captured in reports. And so here are my essential functions. These are the things I said were my essential functions. And the goal is, and I didn't get all the way done putting in data, but the goal is that people would have a reasonable accommodation request that would be auto-generated from the information they put into the tool. And they would be able to copy this out or download a PDF and probably edit and revise it, but be able to use that as the basis of an accommodation request. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll go back to the PowerPoint. All right, and so I just have a few closing thoughts, and then I will stop and we can have some Q&A. The ADA was a landmark law that changed the lives of disabled people in the United States. There's no question about that. But its implementation has been spotty and it has weak enforcement. And as we've done this work, a few additional questions have arisen that I just wanted to relay. One of them is related to the notion of reasonableness. We hear disabled people disparage this concept frequently. And what they say is, who gets to decide what's reasonable? Your reasonable is not my reasonable. Reasonable also just sort of has a feeling of, oh, be reasonable, like don't ask for too much. And so in our work, we've increasingly moved towards using the language of workplace accommodations rather than reasonable accommodations, because it just seems more appropriate and certainly more palatable. And then the second thing I wanted to say was that by now you must see that the reasonable accommodation can take a lot of labor, a lot of time. I mean, what does it add to a job if you have to work through a 6 to 8 hour decision aid just to figure out how to request an accommodation? How is that labor accounted for? Who has to pay that cost? Right now, it's the disabled person who has to put the energy and effort into really thinking through these questions that I've talked about today. And so I just want to leave those thoughts with you. I don't necessarily have answers, but I think that when we think about systems, when we think about how we create environments, workplace environments in particular, that are supportive of people with disabilities, when we think about wanting to increase employment for people with disabilities, we have to think about the systems we have in place and the way that those support and do not support people to work. I'm going to make one shameless plug before I finish. We are recruiting for these 2 small studies. And so there's a self-paced online study for people with disabilities seeking a reasonable accommodation. And we're also going to have a shared decision-making study for a VR counselor and their client with a disability who want to request a reasonable accommodation. And I'm going to give you my contact information in just a minute. And if you're interested, please just reach out to me and I'll get you connected with those studies. And then I'll just let you know that although the tool's not out, we're planning toward a soft launch this summer, just so that we can continue to gather more information about how it works. There's my contact information. It's just mharness@uw.edu. Just make sure to have an ISS instead of an ESS, and it should get to me. And with that, we can move to questions. And I think I will stop share so we can see each other. I did good. I'm on time, Linda.
You did great, Mark, and it was an excellent presentation and really appreciate all your hard work on this. Open for any questions?
Mark, can you talk a little bit about the applications you see for this? Not just with students, but for workers with disabilities? Is this part of the vocational rehabilitation process? Is it a self-accommodation issue? I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we really framed this as just an openly available tool for people to use in any industry that they might be working in. But I do think that there's a real likelihood that people in human resources departments, people who work in vocational counseling may want to take the tool and use it to support their work. We've heard from employers who have said that it's a resource that they might want to link to provide support to disabled employees, and as a way of indicating that they are supportive of reasonable accommodation and providing them a way to help them understand how to make really strong requests. We also have been thinking about, so this is focused on employment. There's a lot of interest in post-secondary education, a tool to support students in post-secondary. And there are some other people who've been working on that, but not developing an online tool, just really developing more paper-based kinds of tools. And so I think that's an opportunity. And the last thing I'd say is that this tool has a lot of words. It takes time to work through. And so it's really targeted towards, somebody who wants to sit down and read a lot of information and spend this time. So we've been thinking, for example, what would it look like to develop a tool that was maybe more appropriate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or for people who don't have the time and energy to take on something like this? What would a more kind of focused, abbreviated, simpler tool look like? And so I think those are the kinds of things that are in the future.
There questions?
Is this tool available for us to also access that website, or is it not open for viewing in that way yet?
It is live online, and I'm happy to share it. We're not kind of marketing it or encouraging people to use it more broadly. But if you know, as professionals, if you want to look at it, we would love feedback. And yeah, I think it's not perfect. So we would absolutely love to hear from you about thoughts you have about what works, what doesn't. I think personally, I think there's still some user interface pieces that are not super intuitive that I'd like to do some more work on. But yeah, bottom line, if you're interested, I'd be happy to share it with you. And if you have feedback about it, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, and Esther, your hand, yeah.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for this. It's really helpful. I previously did work with on a couple different research studies and as OT faculty about OT practitioners with disabilities and OT students with disabilities. And something that we think about a lot is like, how do students learn either if they had classroom accommodations, how do they learn what that looks like in a clinical setting? Or maybe they never had classroom accommodations, but they get in the clinical setting and halfway through fieldwork, they're not passing because it turns out they needed some accommodations. So, and then of course they talk with like lots of people know that they would like accommodations, but the fieldwork process is really, yeah, it's really difficult to ask for accommodations because there's a lot of things not in the student's favor during that process. But anyways, long story short, I think this would be super helpful for that kind of situation too, of like students who are entering the workforce and trying to figure out what accommodations they could ask for. So this
Yeah.
was exciting to see.
No, that's great. I think that's really a good point about that transition to employment from post-secondary. And we've been thinking about that in other spaces. And the one thing that I'm trying to figure out, so we kind of I don't know what's the right word, softballed. We didn't spend a lot of time in this tool trying to define types of accommodations, and so we thought, you know, there's the Job Accommodation Network. They've done all this work. Maybe we'll just link to them, but I think to your point, there's probably some sort of specialization or like ways of creating tools like this that are more targeted towards different professions. And I think healthcare is a great example. The accommodations that are appropriate in a healthcare system, what are those, and how can we show good examples of what those might be? I do some work in corrections, and the kinds of accommodations that are allowed in corrections are different because of security issues within correctional settings. And so, so I think a couple of things, the main thing I hear you saying is like that transition is hard for students partially because you know, even though it's hard to get your accommodations in post-secondary settings, getting those to transition to an employment setting, that's harder, I think. And then the other piece is just the extent to which people are hearing about generic accommodations versus hearing about more specific things that relate to their actual work. So yeah, those are really good points.
Mark, we have a question in the chat that's asking if you can put the link to the tool in the chat, or would you rather people email you?
I think it's okay to put the link in. I would just say, you know, don't post it on social media or try to share it, because I think it's not quite ready to go at that level. We just have it running on a little server. But if you want to just take a look at it, it's sitting right there, and you're more than welcome to. You'll need to set up an account, and then you can play with it. I did go into it today, and I saw a couple bugs that I of course, right before. So my IT director is working on that right now. You might want to wait a day or two, and those hopefully will be fixed.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Esther's noted that there's an error when she's trying to open it.
Oh, you know what? Hang on.
Thank you, Mark, but yeah, what Esther said.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let me try. I think I copied a link when I was in the reports. Let me see if that works better. And actually, let me just paste. It won't keeps pasting it.
There
With
we
that.
go. Thank you.
Does that work? Okay, good.
Yes. And it's not going in social media, don't worry.
Perfect. Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. All right. Other questions from Mark? So Mark, I just wanted to let people know as our NIDLR invited lecturer that we do offer your services as consulting with our staff here at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. I know that the Vocational Rehabilitation Department is interested in connecting with you. I did send you an email this morning about some preferred times, but if there's anyone else here that's on the webinar that has an interest in meeting with Mark, just let us know. And we'll be happy to set up those accommodations. Just to let you know, Mark is in Pacific time, so he's 2 hours behind. So when you're thinking about times that you're available, early morning is probably not the best.
I refuse 7 a.m. meetings now. I'm old enough.
Yes.
Well,
Understandably so.
I would just say thank you to Linda, Alan, and Deb. They were very supportive as we worked with them in this grant. We were not always the most timely in our reporting on Deb, and so anyway, it's been great working with you guys, and hopefully we'll be able to move this forward and do some additional things with it.
Thank you, Mark. Great to get an update on 5 years plus of labor on this project. Very, very successful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else?
I don't think so. I think I owe Deb a report for that, but that's what I'm remembering as I look at you on camera.
It's all good.
All right. I know what it's due.
This week is good.
Okay. All right. I will try.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep. You bet.